By 2011, Muammar Gaddafi had been ruling Libya for more than 40 years. He survived potential coups, international sanctions, and several wars. But in the final months of his life, everything suddenly changed. Violence erupted in Libya and the cities turned into war zones. And for Gaddafi, everything didn't end inside a palace or in front of a judge, but on the ground, isolated and surrounded by enemies. Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a small camp in the desert near Sirte, Libya. He was born into a poor Bedouin family. As a young man, he joined the military and studied in Libya and later in the United Kingdom. In 1969, at the age of 27, he led a bloodless coup against King Idris and completely seized power. From then on, Gaddafi had a firm grip on the country. He abolished the monarchy, closed the US and UK military bases, and placed the oil industry under state control. He established his own political system called Jamahiriya, which he claimed gave power to the people, but in reality, he still held all the power. In the 70s and 80s, Gaddafi became known worldwide for his radical ideas and support for armed groups in different countries. He was implicated in several attacks, including the 1988 Pan Am Flight 103 bombing in Lockerbie, Scotland, where 270 people lost their lives. Because of this, Libya was subjected to severe international sanctions for many years. But Gaddafi also tried to present himself as a Pan-African and Pan-Arab leader. He pushed for the unity of African countries and wanted to be seen as a bold voice against the West. By the 2000s, he began to soften his image, gave up some weapon programs, re-established relations with Western nations, and tried to improve Libya's economy. But inside the country, many were angry. The government had strict control, political parties were banned, there was no freedom of speech, corruption was widespread, and only a few people benefited from the wealth from oil. Gaddafi and his family lived in luxury while most Libyans struggled. So when the protests broke out in February 2011, it was no surprise that so many people joined. In Benghazi, the second largest city in Libya, chaos erupted after the successful uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. The uprising in this region was called the Arab Spring. In Libya, it began on February 15, when families of political prisoners gathered in front of a police station to demand the release of human rights lawyer Fatih Terbal. He was arrested that day after speaking out about the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, where more than 1,200 prisoners were killed by Gaddafi's security forces. The protest rapidly intensified, and by February 17, the Day of Rage, it had gained major momentum. Thousands of Libyans took to the streets of Benghazi, Baida, Tobruk, and Derna. They were angry about decades of dictatorship, poverty, and oppression. But instead of allowing them to protest peacefully, they were fired upon by security forces, including the feared Internal Security Agency and revolutionary committees. According to reports from the hospital, more than 230 people were killed in just 4 days. Many were hit in the chest and head, proof that live ammunition was used against unarmed people. Instead of calming the situation, the government sent more soldiers and even placed snipers on rooftops to eliminate the protesters. State media insisted that the uprising was the work of foreign agents and misguided youth. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the son of Gaddafi, appeared on TV and threatened that there would be rivers of blood if the protests did not stop. But this only strengthened the people's resistance. By the last week of February, some military units had defected. In Benghazi, some soldiers refused to attack civilians. The 36th Brigade was led by Major General Sulaiman Mahmoud. They broke away from the regime and helped the rebels take control of the city. Some government buildings were set on fire, police stations were attacked, and weapons were stolen from several military camps. By February 24, almost the entire eastern part of Libya was no longer under Gaddafi's control. In Tobruk, there were Staffa, Baida, and Saya. Intense clashes are also taking place. The rebels are now armed because of the weapons they got from army bases. Some Air Force pilots also refused to bomb the cities, and they flew to Malta to seek asylum. Soon, the National Transitional Council was formed, a temporary governing body that was officially established on February 27 in Benghazi. It was led by former Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil, and the NTC claimed that they represented the revolutionary forces as they began planning for a Libya without Gaddafi. Meanwhile, Gaddafi maintained a tight grip on Tripoli and the surrounding areas in the west. He was accompanied by elite units like the Qamis Brigade, led by his son Qamis Gaddafi. They had tanks and artillery. He hired foreign mercenaries from Chad, Mali, and Niger to suppress the uprising. By the first week of March 2011, the situation had reached a critical point. Gaddafi's forces used heavy weapons, tanks, and air power to retake the cities held by the rebels. Civilians were being bombed, especially in places like Benghazi and Adabia. International media showed shocking images of homes and communities destroyed by artillery. The fear grew even worse that Gaddafi would carry out a massacre if he reached Benghazi. On March 12, the Arab League called an emergency meeting and called for the implementation of a no-fly zone over Libya. This was important because it provided regional support for possible international intervention. In the same week, France and the United Kingdom chose the United Nations to take action. On March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973 with 10 votes in favor and 5 abstentions, including Russia and China. This resolution allowed the use of all necessary measures to protect civilians, including the implementation of a no-fly zone. It also prohibited all flights that could be used for military operations, and called for an immediate ceasefire. Just 2 days later, on March 19, the airstrikes began. This was led by a coalition that included the US, France, the UK, Canada, and Italy. They targeted Gaddafi's air defense system, radar, and military communication network. More than 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from US and UK warships in the Mediterranean. French fighter jets also bombed tanks approaching Benghazi. The operation was called Operation Odyssey Dawn, in response to Gaddafi's attacks on civilians, especially in cities held by the rebels. On March 23, NATO took full control of the operation under a new name, Operation Unified Protector, which included 28 NATO members and several partner countries such as Qatar, UAE, and Jordan. Due to the speed of the air campaign, a large part of Gaddafi's military infrastructure was destroyed. The air campaign crushed Gaddafi's MiG-23 fighter jets, Sukhoi bombers, and several air bases. NATO also targeted long-range rocket launchers, supply convoys, and command centers. Within the first 2 weeks, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, especially in the battles in Misrata and Zintan. At sea, NATO enforced an arms embargo, so no ship carrying weapons for Gaddafi's forces was able to get through. NATO warships patrolled the coast of Libya and prevented vessels suspected of carrying military supplies. But even though his military had already suffered heavy damage, Gaddafi still remained stubborn. He repeatedly made statements on state television, accusing NATO of trying to take over Libya. He called the rebels traitors and swore to cleanse the country al-Sadr street by street. He also accused foreigners of stealing Libya's oil and interfering in the country's internal affairs. His forces are trying to shoot down NATO planes using Russian-made surface-to-air missiles, but this has not stopped the airstrikes. By the middle of 2011, the situation was already favoring the rebels. NATO continues to target Gaddafi's supply routes and weapon depots, which is why his forces are now stretched thin. The rebels from the western mountains, Misrata Front, and eastern Libya began to approach Tripoli from different directions. On August 20, 2011, the rebels launched Operation Mermaid Dawn, the final major attack. This was a carefully planned operation, with fighters secretly brought into the city several days before the assault. At the right moment, they simultaneously rose up from within the capital, as the rebel convoys approached from outside. For 5 days, intense fighting took place in various districts. Tajura, Fashlam, and Sol al-Juma were some of the areas where the clashes were most intense. The loyalist forces used snipers and tanks to defend their positions, but they couldn't withstand the speed of the rebels' advance. Many of Gaddafi's soldiers surrendered or simply abandoned their posts. On August 23, the rebels captured Bab al-Sizia, Gaddafi's heavily fortified compound in the center of Tripoli. For more than 4 decades, this served as the center of his power. It is surrounded by strong walls, bunkers, and underground tunnels. When the rebels entered, they saw various luxuries, weapons, documents, and signs that people inside had hurriedly escaped. But Gaddafi was no longer there. By the time Tripoli was falling, he had already left the city. According to intelligence reports, he left on August 19th or 20, before the final attack began. It is believed that he was hiding in different safe houses, helped by tribes loyal to him. On August 29, his wife Safia Fakrash, his son Ali, and his children Anibal and Mohammed crossed over to Algeria. They were given temporary asylum. Another one of his sons, Saadi Gaddafi, fled to Niger, where he was later arrested. But Gaddafi himself refused to leave Libya. For him, leaving meant total defeat. So he decided to hide in different places, which were still controlled by tribes loyal to him, especially around his hometown, Sirte. Sirte, which is on the Mediterranean coast. Foreigners, 450 kilometers from Tripoli and 570 kilometers from Benghazi, was very important to Gaddafi. It wasn't just his hometown, he turned it into a modern city while he was in power. This is where African Union summits were held, and he even once suggested making it the capital of the United States of Africa. Gaddafi arrived in Sirte in early September 2011, accompanied by a dwindling group of loyalists. Most of those with Gaddafi were his close associates, bodyguards, and fighters from the Gaddafi tribe, his own tribe, which had strong influence in the area. Two of his sons, Mutassim Gaddafi, a military commander, and Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, whom he considered his political heir, were also believed to have moved from one hiding place to another around Sirte. After the fall of Tripoli, Sirte became Gaddafi's last stronghold. With communications cut off, supplies running out, and no control over other parts of Libya, he still refused to flee or surrender. By the second week of September, the National Transitional Council began to surround Sirte. The NTC, which at that time was recognized by many countries as the new government of Libya, sent thousands of fighters from various brigades. There were forces coming from Misrata, Benghazi, and Zintan, advancing simultaneously from the east and west. Their goal was to capture Gaddafi and ultimately reclaim the country. The rebels thought the battle would end quickly, but Sirte's defenses were strong. Loyalist fighters, snipers, and artillery were positioned inside the city. They used houses, schools, hospitals, and other buildings as their strongholds. There were also many traps, landmines, and IEDs scattered along the main roads. The heavy shelling by the NTC began in mid-September. Every day, Grad rockets, mortars, and tank fire hit the penitentiary buildings. At the same time, NATO planes were dropping bombs on the bunkers and command centers. Many civilians tried to escape, but many were also trapped inside. The city's facilities gradually collapsed without electricity, and the water supply and hospitals were destroyed. Inside Sirte, Gaddafi and his small group kept moving from abandoned houses to underground bunkers to avoid being detected. The former command structure was destroyed. The morale of the loyalists had collapsed. But Gaddafi continued to give orders to fight until the end. Mutassim was in charge of the city's defense and their last attempt to push back the rebels. By the latter part of September, Sirte was completely surrounded. The NTC controlled the area and began advancing, block by block. Intense fighting, sniper fire, and street battles slowed them down. Hundreds of fighters from both sides were lost. While this was happening, NATO jets continued to fly overhead, searching for any sign of where Gaddafi was. Using drones and surveillance aircraft, they analyzed heat signatures and radio signals. Because of this, Gaddafi was ordered to avoid using any electronic equipment. They rarely turned on their remaining satellite phone and often relied on couriers who walked through alleyways to deliver messages. There was no electricity and no water, and they depended on canned goods or whatever supplies they had. Only a small amount of supplies was brought in by loyalist civilians. The wounded were treated with very basic equipment, with almost no antibiotics. Many also got sick due to hunger, dehydration, and various other conditions. At this point, only about 200 fighters loyal to Gaddafi remained. Most of them were from his tribe and neighboring towns. They formed a small but tightly guarded convoy watching his every move. With them was Abu Bakr al-Abubakar Yunus Jabbar, Libya's longtime defense minister. They were the last circle of his power. According to eyewitnesses and reports after the war, Gaddafi's health had already declined. He was pale, thin, and visibly tired. The confidence and poise he once showed on TV were gone. But even in this state, his resolve was still strong. He would not surrender unless he was absolutely forced to do so. He no longer appeared in public after Tripoli fell. While he used to frequently appear on state TV, now he had completely disappeared. He knew that even the smallest leak about his location could be the reason for a NATO airstrike. His silence was also a tactic. He wanted the world to think that he was gone or already in another country. But Gaddafi still had a plan: to escape out of Sirte and head further south, maybe to Saba, a city in the desert, or to cross the border into Niger, which at that time was a hiding place for some of his officials. But all the routes out were closed. The roads were being watched, and almost every convoy leaving the city was attacked or forced to turn back. As they became more trapped, Gaddafi's group grew more desperate. They took turns sleeping, with some keeping watch while others rested. They narrowed the building entrances with sandbags and debris to avoid being seen by drones. But their movements were still limited, and each day the situation grew worse. By mid-October, it was clear that Gaddafi could no longer defend Sirte. And on October 19th, he made the most important decision. He would try to escape that night with his remaining inner circle. The plan was to form a convoy with more than 50 vehicles. Most of them were pickup trucks and SUVs equipped with mounted machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons. Vehicles full of ammunition and weapons, while others were for the personnel, guards, and personal staff of Gaddafi. Included in the convoy were Namotassim Gaddafi, Abu Bakr al-Abu Bakr Yunus Jabbar, Mansour Dao, who was the chief of security, several high-ranking military officials, and some family members. They knew that escaping was very dangerous, and to avoid being noticed, they chose to leave at night. At around 8 p.m. on October 19th, the convoy began to move from a hidden location inside the city. They moved without lights, sticking close to the buildings and trees. They were hoping the darkness would be on their side. Their target was to reach the outskirts of Sirte, then take the desert route to Wadi Samsam, and from there continue to Saba, where they planned to cross over to Niger or Algeria. But what they didn't know was that they had been under surveillance for quite some time. For weeks, NATO surveillance drones had been focused on Sirte. The Americans and the French also had data on any suspicious movements. And on that very night, a U.S. Predator drone detected the heat signature of a convoy slowly leaving the city. By the next day, October 20, when they reached the western part of Sirte, they were spotted more clearly. At 8:30 in the morning, NATO decided to end it. In the air, the Predator drone fired a Hellfire missile at one of the lead vehicles. It hit, and the front convoy suddenly stopped. Just a few minutes later, a French jet arrived and dropped a laser-guided bomb at the rear of the convoy. Their cars burst into flames. Both ends were hit, so the others were trapped in the middle and chaos broke out. Gaddafi's men tried to fight back, but they were really at a disadvantage. Many cars were crushed, some were thrown, some collided while escaping. Dozens of loyalists were immediately wiped out, and those who survived ran farther away, hiding in ruined buildings, vacant lots, and a large drainage pipe by the side of the road. Gaddafi, along with Mutassim, Mansour Dao, and others, also survived. Covered in dust and injuries, they crawled into the wide and dark pipe. It was only about 4 feet wide, just enough for a person to fit. There they waited in silence, hoping they wouldn't be discovered. But the rebels from Misrata were getting closer. They had been following the convoy for a long time and reached the place after just a short while. They were carrying heavy weapons, rifles, grenades, and machine guns. They searched the area, the wrecked cars, and the buildings. Soon, someone spotted drops of blood and footprints. When they followed the trail, they found the entrance to the drainage pipe. They threw a grenade ahead and then slowly approached. There they saw Gaddafi kneeling inside the pipe, wearing dirty pants, a torn shirt, and still wearing a flak vest. His hair was messy, his face was full of wounds and mud. There were injuries on his arms, back, and legs, probably from the explosion. They pulled Gaddafi out and he could barely walk. Mutassim, although injured, was also captured just a few moments later. Abu Bakr Yunus Jabbar was also captured, but he was seriously wounded, and the others who tried to escape were either attacked or immediately caught. Mansour was reportedly among those captured alive. He himself confirmed that they were trying to escape to Saba when their convoy was hit by an airstrike. The rebels brought Gaddafi to the side of the road. They made him sit down and then put him in the back of a pickup truck. More and more fighters arrived as news quickly spread on radios and cell phones that Gaddafi had been captured. So people started flocking to the area. As the truck moved slowly, they began to harm Gaddafi. Some attacked him with sticks, fists, and the butt of their weapons. Some pulled his hair, others tore his clothes. The shouting was a mix of anger, foul language, and mentions of people who were tortured and blown up under his regime. Some even climbed onto the back of the truck to get closer to him. At that point, almost no one had any control. What happened to him was seen in various videos circulating around the world. He was slumped with serious head and side injuries. There was even a moment when he tried to get up, but he was pushed back down. For several minutes, he was assaulted while the truck tried to pass through the narrow road filled with armed rebels. Up to now, the exact moment of his death is still unclear. According to the doctors, he suffered injuries to the head and abdomen. There are also some who say that he was killed during the commotion at the back of the truck. Others believe that a fighter deliberately carried out the attack. There was no official trial, no statement that he was punished, and no one came forward to admit using the last bullet. The only thing certain is that when the truck arrived at the checkpoint controlled by the NTC, Muhammad Gaddafi was already dead. His body was covered in injuries, his shirt was torn, and his pants were wet. He had many gunshot wounds and severe injuries, and doctors confirmed that he died around 1:00 p.m. on October 20th, 2011 at the age of 69. His body was brought to Misrata, one of the cities most severely affected by the war. For 3 days, his body was placed in a refrigerated meat locker at the market, guarded by Misrata fighters. Hundreds of people lined up to see it. Some took photos, some recorded videos, and for some, this was justice, while for others, it was revenge. Mu'tasim Gaddafi and Abu Bakr Bakar Yunus Jabbar were also brought to Misrata. Both of them were killed shortly after being captured. Mu'tasim died from gunshot wounds to the neck and chest, while Jabbar died from injuries sustained during the attack on the convoy. By October 23, 3 days after Gaddafi's disappearance, the NTC declared that the war was over. After nearly 8 months of intense fighting and more than 30,000 lives lost, Libya was officially under a new government. But the big question that followed was, where would Gaddafi be buried? On the night of October 25, 2011, he was buried in a remote part of the desert in western Libya. And until now, the public still doesn't know the exact location. His end was harsh, a reflection of his rule that was full of cruelty and fear. And even though he's gone, many questions remain unanswered. Who fired the last bullet? Why wasn't he brought to court? Could his capture have ended differently? But for most Libyans, the chapter is closed.